The notice came in the form of a generic email, with the same aesthetic as those pizzeria flyers that forget to proofread the text. It was from the HOA, of course. Subject: Aesthetic and Functional Maintenance Inspection of Rural Properties, Neighboring Residential Areas. A fancy name to hide the real intention. Karen's impromptu patrol was going to knock on my ranch, thinking it could dictate the rules. The message said that volunteers from the association would be passing through on an informational basis to analyze the points of suitability between urban zones and rural production areas. Nice words to say that someone was going to try to measure the size of my fence with a school ruler. Further down, the icing on the cake. The members will be duly identified and kindly ask residents for their cooperation. Collaboration. As if my patience for receiving people who don't even know how to tie a boot properly was voluntary. On the appointed day, I didn't bother to hide. I sat on the balcony, strong coffee in hand, dog lying on the carpet, and the posture of someone who won't lower his head even if he stumbles. At 9:20, here they came. 3 figures, 2 men and a woman, all wearing dark blue vests. Badges with photos taken on a white background so badly cut out that it looked like a child's montage. And in the middle of them, a black briefcase, the kind that gives you a false sense of power. At the front of the trio was a tall man with a thin mustache and a tense posture, who looked as if he had rehearsed his walk in the mirror before leaving the house. The other looked out of place, as if he had been dragged along by his wife, who, by the way, was holding a clipboard with the eyes of someone who thinks that ticking a box on a form gives you legal authority. They came in a line with millimetrically calculated steps. When they stopped at the gate, the one with the mustache hesitated for 2 seconds. And then came the moment I knew would come. He cleared his throat, straightened his vest, and said in a slightly choked voice, "Good morning, sir. We're here on behalf of the HOA. Making a routine visit. With all cordiality, of course, sir. I hadn't even said anything yet. I hadn't stood up. I hadn't made a move. I was just sitting there, looking. But the sight and aura of the ranch was enough for them to sense that it wasn't amateur territory. Sir slipped out of his mouth with the formality of someone who understood that there was a limit to the joke. The woman tried to complete her speech with more confidence, but stumbled over the words. She said something about visual adjustments for harmonious integration. She stuttered, lost the thread. Because the fence she wanted to evaluate was already showing signs that it wasn't going to bend to the tape measure. I stood up slowly. I put the mug on the table. I walked unhurriedly to the gate. Every step made it clear that this was no front condominium. It was a ranch, land with a name, sweat, and a deed. And when I stopped in front of them, the silence was heavier than any speech. The one with the mustache stepped forward, stretching out his hand as if to seal a diplomatic agreement. I didn't refuse. I just held it firmly enough for him to understand that touch speaks more than a contract. He spoke again. "Just a quick visit, sir, to check. It's not invasive. Everything is within the association's plan." I asked to see the plan. It wasn't in the official documents. It was a makeshift annex, with a badly placed stamp, a copy of the bylaws with handwritten notes, and a loose piece of paper with Karen's guidelines, in pink. It said that some properties need to be monitored to avoid visual and functional conflicts with the overall harmony of the community. That was it. They wanted to tell me that my ranch was too ugly for the association's liking, that perhaps my tractor was visually impacting the sensitive eyes of the residents of the new zone. I took a deep breath without replying. I looked at them one by one. The second man was already half bent over, looking sideways as if he wanted to escape without a trace. The woman was pretending to write, but her pen was out of its cap. So I said, without raising my voice, "The ranch has a deed, a license, a tractor with the IPVA up to date, and an owner with little time for a patrol dressed up as an urban commando. If you want to look at something, look at what Karen doesn't have the courage to say in front of you. But here, What counts is the law, not colored paper. The trio looked at each other. The one with the mustache snorted again. He took a step back, and then came the sentence that made me hold back my laughter. "Perfectly, sir. Let's just note that we were well received. With all due respect. Thank you, sir." They left as they had arrived, lined up, but now with their backs a little more hunched. The briefcase closed, the clipboard glued to their bodies. The silence of the trio was the soundtrack of silent defeat. Karen didn't show up. Of course she didn't. It was obvious that she had sent the three of them as a test, as an experiment. But the result was different, because respect, on dirt, isn't demanded. It's imposed, with presence, with history, with a ranch. The HOA patrol's visit to my ranch, even though it ended with 3 gentlemen said in less than 2 minutes, and the discreet escape of a trio with no morals, didn't serve to soothe the wounded ego of those pulling the strings. Karen didn't take well to the fact that she had to swallow failure without an audience. So, like someone who organizes a show because drama needs an audience, she called the famous extraordinary meeting. The announcement arrived the next morning. Full-bodied paper, HOA logo at the top, opening paragraph with words chosen to appear neutral, but which screamed intention, meeting to align guidelines and harmonize aesthetics between urban and rural areas. Below, the date, time, and the familiar location, the association's multi-purpose hall, where they usually decide on the color of the fence, the pruning schedule, and other trivialities that don't affect those who have a tractor in their backyard and boots on their feet. I was unsure about going, but I was more curious to see how far she would stretch the rope. On Saturday afternoon, I went. Plaid shirt, boots on, a steady gaze. I walked into the room and realized the mood. It was like entering a soap opera, where everyone already knows that the villain is going to give a speech, and nobody wants to be the extra who applauds. Karen was in the center, with a portable microphone in her hand and a clipboard under her arm. She was wearing a beige suit, heavy makeup, and that election campaign smile disguised as politeness. Next to her, a small speaker, a bottle of mineral water, and a pile of papers, probably printouts of the visual requalification plan for the bordering properties, or, as I prefer to call it, the manual on how to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. She began her speech with false modesty. She said that she knew that many people were busy, that she respected everyone's time, and that this meeting was just a collective effort for visual well-being and harmonious integration of the neighborhood with its productive borders. When she said productive frontiers, everyone knew it was the ranch. She showed slides, she showed photos, and among them there was my property, taken from a distance, with a bad zoom, with a red arrow pointing to the shed, and another highlighting the parked tractor. He talked about visual pollution, landscape obstacle, impacting structure. He tried to use technical terms but stumbled over his own arrogance. He said it was necessary to regulate what was seen from outside the properties, because the aesthetic impression influenced the real estate valuation of the community. In other words, my tractor, my shed, my wooden balcony could, according to her, lower the price of the house of someone who lives 3 blocks away and has never set foot in the mud. The audience was a mixture of embarrassment and boredom. Some looked at their cell phones, others exchanged glances. But the silence continued until she tried her last card. What we need is to establish an ideal visual model, a standard that enhances every corner of the neighborhood, and, if necessary, apply corrective measures, even if they are symbolic. That's when one of the neighbors raised his hand. Mr. Alankar, a former resident, with a straight face. He said, "So the problem isn't the ranch. It's what you see when you look at it. Because the tractor you call ugly has already helped clean up floods here, and that shed you want to hide was where they kept donations when the community needed them." Silence. Silence again, but this time a full silence, full of weight, of embarrassment, of truth. Karen tried to respond with a smile. She said that she respected all opinions, but that there was a need to maintain visual harmony as a factor of belonging. The sentence was as empty as it was far-fetched, a bunch of echoing words and no content. The rest of the meeting went downhill. People left before the end. Nobody signed anything. No formal support. Her plan to turn my ranch into the enemy of the neighborhood oozed pretentiousness. On my way out, I passed her. I didn't tease her. I didn't say anything. But it only took one look for her to understand that the meeting had been less extraordinary and more of a warning. The neighborhood knows how to distinguish between those who live here and those who want to rule for vanity's sake. The ranch? Still the same. A firm shed, a tractor at rest, and the veranda receiving the late afternoon sun. Only now with a new sign, made by a friend who is also a neighbor. Impressive look since 1979. No entry for arrogance in a blue vest. The failure of the extraordinary meeting hit deep into the pride of the woman who tried to turn my ranch into a collective problem based on visual impact. After failing with a microphone, coffee, and badly diagrammed slides, she did what people like this always do when voice isn't enough. She tried to use the weight of paper. But not just any paper. She wanted paper with a stamp, with timbre, with enough legal language to scare. 3 days after the meeting, I received a brown envelope hand-delivered by a hired motorcycle courier. The kind of delivery that comes with an obligatory signature and that "this is serious" energy. I opened it in front of the guy, just out of stubbornness. Inside was a letter from the HOA, copied to a lawyer with a fancy surname and a firm in a posh neighborhood, requesting aesthetic and functional adaptation of my property, according to the visual parameters established at a meeting. Yes, she had the audacity to turn the fiasco of the meeting into a legal argument. The text said that my ranch had high-impact structural elements that compromised the visual continuity of the neighborhood, that the arrangement of vehicles and equipment in visible areas could characterize disrespect for the urban standard, and that measures were expected within 15 working days to begin the adaptation. It went on to say that if there was no response, the case could be taken to the municipal authorities responsible for analyzing violations of the community's visual order. Visual order. It was almost poetic. So absurd. I laughed. I laughed because the letter mixed formality with desperation. It was a document that wanted to look official, but smelled like an attempt at revenge with letterhead. I took the document to the office of Dr. Italo, my lawyer, and an old acquaintance in the area. He read it over with the calm of someone who has seen it all, then let out a short laugh. This has more adjectives than arguments, but we'll respond as required. The answer was short, polite, and fatal. First, he pointed out that the HOA has no legal power over private properties outside the zone directly regulated by the association's bylaws. Second, he pointed out that there had been no formal deliberation or valid vote on any kind of mandatory aesthetic adjustment. Third, it stressed that the ranch complies with all municipal, state, and environmental laws, and that any attempt to force changes without legal backing would be treated as an abuse of authority and harassment. Finally, he asked that any further attempts to contact him be made exclusively through legal channels, and that intimidating notices with no legal basis could amount to harassment. The letter was filed and sent with a copy to the town hall and also to the local prosecutor's office, not as a formal complaint, but as a warning. Because if someone decides to play with the law, they need to learn that the law is not a toy. The reply was received on Monday. On Tuesday, Karen showed up at HOA headquarters wearing sunglasses, her hair tied back, talking quietly to the only 2 members who still paid attention to her. On Wednesday, a new statement from the HOA appeared pasted on the wall. The association reinforces that any aesthetic suggestions are for guidance only and have no coercive force on properties outside the directly linked zone. In other words, everything it tried to impose was worthless. The attempt to use paper became a joke. One of the neighbors even started collecting her pamphlets and set up a museum of attempted control in the message group. Each print came with a sarcastic caption, like "Regulation of Urban Utopia" or "Aesthetics as a Weapon of Oppression." The best was when the gentleman from House 12, who never said anything, sent the following message in the group: "My tractor is visible. So is my soul. Whoever wants to, cover their eyes." Karen disappeared again. So has her lawyer. Her pompous surname became synonymous with desperate attempt among the residents. The mood in the neighborhood lightened. Smiles returned. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other before started chatting. Because the ranch, after all, was never the problem. The problem was the attempt to turn the field into an aesthetic clinic waiting room. And while she was picking up the pieces of her own ego behind the curtains, the ranch was getting a new decoration, a clothesline with bunting and a new handmade sign. Here, you don't bend a fence to fit the standard. Here, the fence stands tall, along with dignity. After the failed attempt to force me to remodel the ranch with arguments as flimsy as her invented authority, the woman decided she needed a dignified ending, at least in her mind. Because dignity, at that point, had already become legend in her career. But since every plot that drags on needs a final scene, she decided to organize a reconciliation meeting. The message came by letter. Yes, again, always the paperwork. But this time in a white envelope, with more restrained, almost humble writing. It said, "I would like to schedule a personal and respectful conversation with you in order to clarify misunderstandings and seek a more peaceful and harmonious coexistence between the parties." He signed with his first name only. No title, no acronym, no coordinator of anything. For the first time, there was no letterhead, no copy for the lawyer. I accepted, not because I believed in sincerity, but because I wanted to see how far the act went. And above all, because a self-respecting ranch doesn't refuse to talk. As long as it's face-to-face, no frills, no microphone. We made an appointment for a late afternoon. I suggested the ranch itself. I wanted her to set foot on the land she had criticized so much, to take a closer look at what she had always pointed out from afar. When she arrived, she came alone. No folders, papers, or accompaniments. She wore simple clothes, without heavy makeup, and with the eyes of someone who has already understood that the stage has collapsed. She got out of the car with a hesitant step. He stopped in front of the gate as if waiting for permission. I signaled with my hand, without saying a word. He walked to the balcony and sat down where the chair was pulled up. The dog didn't even bark. Perhaps it had understood what was going on before I had. The silence was long, long and necessary, because before any sentence, it was her gaze that needed to say what her mouth could no longer sustain. And there it was, the expression of defeat without an audience, of falling without scandal. She started slowly. She said she wasn't there to relive anything or justify it, that she had understood that the neighborhood was not a whiteboard on which she could draw her wishes, that perhaps she had gone too far, maybe. A word that still tried to hold its pose, but with no real force. I didn't interrupt. I let it speak. I let each comma weigh in time. She tried to suggest a deal. She said she would commit to no longer involving the HOA in matters related to the ranch, that she would ask for the removal of the flyers still scattered around, that she recognized the value of my presence there. All this with a low voice and eyes that avoided facing me. And then came what she probably thought was the strongest part. She apologized. It was a weak, timid apology, with an "if" at the front. If, in any way, my actions have caused you discomfort. It sounded more like protocol than a real apology, but it served as closure. Because deep down, it didn't even matter anymore. The damage had already been done. The attempt at domination had failed, and the mask she had worn for months was in pieces, scattered all over the neighborhood. I responded with a single gesture. I got up, went to the corner of the balcony, and came back with a box. Inside were all the leaflets, letters, notices, and prints that she herself had distributed over the last few months. I handed them to her. She stared. She touched the paper as if seeing her own reflection in the exaggeration for the first time. She folded everything slowly, put it on her lap, and sat still. I got up from my chair. I looked up at the sky, at the sun that was already leaving, and said, "Whoever plants order with imposition reaps silence, and sometimes that silence is all that remains." She understood. She got up too. She left in silence. She didn't ask for anything else. She didn't turn around. She just got in her car and drove off. That week, the neighbors noticed the change. Karen didn't attend the HOA meeting. She didn't send a notice. She didn't post a note. She didn't give her opinion on the fence, the flower, or the truck. Her house had the lights off for days. Some say she traveled. Others say she's moving out. Nobody knows for sure, but everyone feels it's over. At the ranch, the sound is once again just bugs and wind. The chair on the veranda is still there, but now there's another one next to it, empty, as a reminder of that day when arrogance sat there and left smaller than it arrived. And the sign at the entrance has been given a new line. Respect comes through the front door. Vanity leaves quietly.